Hey, welcome everybody to this webinar on redefining stroke services and sustaining industry collaboration. Sorry if there's a bit of an echo on this line. My name is Gary Ford. I'm Chief Executive of the Oxford Academic Health Science Network and a stroke physician in Oxford, and I will be chairing this meeting. We chose stroke as a topic to look at in this joint webinar between the Academic Health Science Network and ABHI, because it's very indicative of the challenges the management of stroke patients face, particularly with the way we've had to adapt during the pandemic, and also the opportunities that there are with innovation in digital and diagnostics, and the importance of us collaborating effectively with industry who are producing this innovation, that we effectively deploy that for the benefit of patients. So we have four short talks and then half an hour for discussions. As you can read, slides will be available. The meeting will be recorded and available to view afterwards. And please use the chat function to ask questions. You can put those in as it goes along, and we will look at those at the end. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Suzanne Ali Hassan, who's Head of Commercial Engagement at Ucl Partners. Susie was Head of Corporate Engagement at Northern Health Science Alliance before moving to UCLP, and before that worked in NHR with Knockery. So a lot of experience of working across the interface between the NHS academia and industry. So, Suzanne, over to you.
Many thanks, Gary. Good afternoon, everyone. To introduce myself again, Susie Hassan from UCL Partners. Next slide, please. I'll begin just briefly to introduce the Academic Health Science Network to those that are unfamiliar, although I'm assuming most will be somewhat familiar with what we do. We're funded by NHS England and Improvement, and also some money from the Office for Life Sciences, to what I like to describe as building capacity and acting really as the innovation arm for the National Health Service. We work broadly sub-regionally to respond to local need and to reflect local disease burdens and demographics and local populations. And what we aim to do is improve health outcomes, patient outcomes, population health, drive costs down in the system, and also stimulate economic growth. So an awful lot of that, of course, is brought together by working and forming external partnerships, collaborating with industry, and really acting as a conduit to external and commercial partners and the National Health Service. Next slide, please. Just to touch on UCL Partners as an example, really. So UCLP is one of the 3 London-based AHSNs. We cover a geography across North East Central London, out beyond borders into Essex and north into Hertfordshire. So we're a membership of 23 NHS trusts, 9 universities, 6 STPs or newly ICSs, and over a population of about 6.2 million people. So it's really quite an ecosystem. And we're there really to enable partnerships and convene across that geography to support change and spread then further regionally, locally, and of course nationally as well. So next slide, please. Sorry, just go one up. One little fast there. No, there we go. Yeah, so just to talk broadly about commercial innovation working, every HSM will be slightly different, but as I've described, building those partnerships across industry, advising them around market access and opportunities of engagement with the NHS, and helping the NHS system articulate the needs. So today we'll be talking about specifically stroke services, but working across secondary care, primary care, and community services, and also specialist tertiary centres, really helping bring in external expertise to drive change. We also work closely with our academic communities as well. So next slide, please. Working with industry really follows quite sort of broad parameters where we want to enable those connections. And generally with large pharma and medtech, we stimulate sort of joint partnerships and placements, or via medical education grants, really, to support transformation projects, be them in quality improvement or adoption of a new innovation, and helping really improve patient outcomes and understanding of changes happening within the health system. Most recently, we've done some work with Bayer, where during the COVID pandemic, there was a uncertainty about how patients responded to the change of using warfarin and moving on to DOAC. So we produced some patient-facing videos with Bayer to support that education, that learning, and it was very well received within primary care. We also work with our local and national accelerator partners, so you'll be familiar with the NHS Innovation Accelerator and others, and international companies, really to stimulate market-led adoption and spread. So where there's a really compelling, robust value proposition, how do we build awareness of that in the system and help make that change happen? And most recently, particularly with AI and digital solutions, we look at helping industry partner with NHS providers to co-design and develop new solutions that are perhaps bespoke to a particular problem, but also designing of new clinical pathways. Next slide, please. And once those partnerships are successful and once they've been validated and they're working very well, we want to build awareness of this and really look at championing or supporting NHS championed innovations to spread across our network, to spread across the health system in England and build awareness of it. Where they're working well, I think that's one of our biggest assets as the network, is to actually ensure that more people are aware of it and can look at adopting something locally. Next slide, please. Just to briefly touch on this, some may be aware of the AHSN network-wide reset campaign. So this was looking at specifically supporting times during the COVID pandemic and during its recovery, looking at sharing rapid insights and learnings and spreading them across the system. So there's some themes listed there. Digital and AI, of course, played a key role, and building relationships with industry was also a firm part of that. Just next bit, please. Just an example of some of the webinars and sort of activities we enabled, specifically horizon scanning, where it came to looking for remote diagnostic tools, remote monitoring solutions, which were of course desperately required during the pandemic. Next slide, please. Just to briefly talk of a case study happening within Ucl Partners, but is also looking to be adapted or adopted really nationally. Primary care system, as we'll be well aware, had to transform models of care really rapidly in response to the pandemic. And our primary care innovation team recognised that supporting these long-term conditions within primary and community care was key. So a lot of these indicators, of course, indicative of heart attacks and strokes, atrial fibrillation, blood pressure, cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, where the board principals were creating these digital pathways. So virtual first, digital tools and technologies, engaging the wider primary care workforce and supporting patients in self-management and empowerment of managing their own conditions. And this had to include a selection of appraised digital tools and solutions to enable this. It supported comprehensive search tools based within GP practices to identify these patients. And we're now supporting implementation in regions locally. There's a lot of interest from large corporates around supporting implementation of these tools, where it informs some of their actual their own portfolio. So we're sort of working with those at the moment. And of course, the benefits of this is to significantly reduce the number of heart attacks and stroke at scale with the detection and early detection of CVD and atrial fibrillation. So that's it from me. Thank you. We'll talk a little bit more later at the panel discussion. Thanks very much.
Gary, I think you're on mute.
So I did that to reduce feedback. I do apologise. Thank you very much. Never done it on a webinar before. So thanks, Suzanne, for that overview of the HSN network and some of the work the network and your own HSN is doing. Do put any questions or comments in the chat, and we'll pick those up later. Luella Trickett, Director of Value and Access at ABHI, is now going to give a brief overview of ABHI. Luella spent 25 years in various industry positions and also worked with the Department of Health for 9 months as industry liaison person for the NHS procurement review. So over to you, Luella.
Thank you very much, Gary, and thank you, Susie. For those of you less familiar with the Association of British Health Tech Industries, we're the leading trade association for medical devices, diagnostics and digital. We have about 300 members, of which 90% are SMEs, which is very reflective of the sector as a whole. Our members actually represent about 80% of sales of these technologies to the NHS. We work really closely with the AHSN network on not only individual programs of work, but on the national programs that they deliver, such as supporting the AAC rapid uptake products. Health technologies have been front and center in the response to the COVID crisis. Everything from diagnostics, vaccines and therapeutics through to the critical care equipment to run entire intensive care facilities. And let's not forget PPE. The whole system has pulled together to find solutions rapidly, and collaboration has happened in ways that we have never seen before. Medical technology companies working with car manufacturers. The textiles industry making scrubs, gowns, aprons. Medical technology companies releasing their IP, making it available for other people to manufacture to meet the capacity and the demand. Then we've had the regulatory bodies rapidly assessing and facilitating access to technologies needed to treat patients. Procurement has happened at scale and speed, and the NHS and industry have come together to find solutions for problems for how you treat patients in a COVID-safe way, avoiding unnecessary visits to healthcare establishments and ensuring that vital treatments continue. What we've seen over the last 8 months is a new relationship between industry and the NHS, one that's perhaps more trust-based than it has been in the past, one that recognises each other's strengths, one that's allowed previous barriers to be broken down and the value that each brings to be truly appreciated. The last 8 months have been challenging for everyone, personally and professionally, but collaboration and what it's delivered is perhaps one of the silver linings, and a silver lining that we really mustn't lose. Some of the transformations in collaboration and delivery of patient care must not be temporary. They're not only of value because of COVID, they're invaluable in spite of COVID. And what we'll hear today is examples of real collaboration and how it's benefited patients in the NHS. Thank you, Gary. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Luella. That's really great. And again, just think about any general comments about transformation and change that you've seen that you want to bring into the discussion. We've now got 2 talks with some specific examples of innovation and its impact on stroke patients in prevention and acute treatment. So delighted to introduce Lynn Barnes from iRhythm. And Lynn's worked in the medical device industry for over 30 years in a number of senior international roles, and was in another ECG tech company before moving to iRhythm to develop the SIO ECG service, which I think most stroke physicians are aware of. It's a really interesting technology and packaged into service pathways. So over to you, Lynn.
Thanks very much, Gary. As Gary said, I'm working for iRhythm as a business development manager, and I'm going to start by giving you a brief overview of the product for those of you that aren't familiar with it, and then we'll talk about how a specific example of how it's been taking forward in stroke services. So first slide, please. So Zio XT, to be given its full name, it's a 1 to 14 day continuous ambulatory ECG monitoring service. And we call it a service as opposed to a product, and you'll see why as I go through. But as you can see, it's essentially an adhesive patch that sticks to the chest area here. And that's it. What you see is what you get right there. So there are no electrodes or wires needed. And the big plus now is that we can deliver it direct to the patient's home, or it can be fitted in clinic, or a combination of both, depending what suits the hospital best. The device has an event trigger in the middle there. You press the button. If they're experiencing symptoms, they just click that, and then that will be identified in the report. Once the monitoring's finished, they simply return it to our office here in a reply paid box that we provide, and then we undergo the analysis. Next slide. So in terms of the results, when we begin the analysis, we use our proprietary deep learning AI algorithm for that initial process. And that helps us get through vast amounts of data very, very quickly. However, the final detailed report is always composed by one of our own accredited ECG techs here in the UK. And they typically spend something like 30 to 40 minutes on every single report, composing the final document that you can see an example of on the right-hand side here. That report takes something like 1 to 4 days. We're currently running at 1.2 days once we receive the device, and it will be ready published on our web-based platform, Zero Reports, as a PDF, and the clinician will get an email telling them that it's ready to be viewed. And of course, because it's a PDF, they can view, print, and save to the patient record as you would do any PDF. And you may be able to see on the bottom right-hand corner, whilst the front page here is a summary report, it actually says page 1 of 20. So you can see it is a very detailed report. The tech will compose a short summary in the bottom left-hand side, but the right-hand box is left clear for the clinician's comments and ultimate sign-off. Next slide, please. The device is FDA approved. It was in 2012. It's a Class 2A medical device, and it accurately detects 10 distinct arrhythmias. And as publication in Nature in 2011 showed that we get virtually 100% agreement with clinicians on diagnosis. It also gives 3 times the diagnostic yield of the traditional Holter systems. So it's extensively validated, and I think we're running, it's over 30 peer-reviewed papers now published. In the UK, it's being used in over 100 locations, and of course, many more in the US. And the big plus that we're waiting on at the moment is we hope to get NICE approval early in December. Next slide, please. There are significant benefits, obviously, using a system like this, particularly in the current situation. With more and more clinicians having started doing virtual clinics, essentially means that if the patient needs an ECG test, they don't necessarily have to have a hospital visit at all in the early stages. The clinician prescribes via us, we send to the patient fits, wears, and returns it to us to do the analysis. So the big plus there is that there is no risk from cross-infection. We effectively send a new device to every single patient. And therefore, the need to contaminate just doesn't enter into the process. And it is a fast process. We can therefore offer a very high throughput of patients in a relatively short period of time. So it helps to reduce those waiting times and therefore, obviously, the waiting list. Next slide. We are pleased to say that we get very high diagnostic yields, as I mentioned earlier. We monitor this all the time, and we currently are running at around about 98% of all ECG data we take in. We're getting about 98% diagnostic yield from it. The other big important factor with this, and particularly when you compare it to Holter systems, is that we get a very high patient compliance. As you can see in this lady here, it's very discreet, it's easy to wear, it's shower proof. Patients can continue to exercise. They don't need to take it off for battery charging because the battery lasts for over 2 weeks. And so they really don't mind wearing it. So it does truly, therefore, give you continuous monitoring throughout that period of up to 14 days. The other side effect of a device like this is that there's no limitations on availability. Departments have a limited number of Holter systems typically, and if they're all out, the patient has to wait for one to come in. It's not so with this type of device. And Holter systems also go missing, as I'm reliably informed by many hospitals. Here again, they don't have to be worried about having to replace those every so often. Next slide. So when you start considering all these factors, it becomes clear that when you add up all the clinic costs, repeat clinic visits, repeat tests, doesn't show, etc., when you add up all the costs of running a typical Holter-based type ECG clinic, Zio can offer significant savings. And this is where a business case scenario starts to highlight this very clearly for trusts. The other thing we provide, as a matter of routine, we give a quarterly audit review of a hospital's results. So we'll go into great detail, provide summary of usage, who prescribed how many, and so on, detection rates, the types of arrhythmias, the wear time, the analyzable time, and so on and so forth. Typically 3 or 4 pages of information. But the interesting thing, and what I put at the bottom here, the average days to the first symptomatic arrhythmia, that 3.6 days, is our national average for all Zios used in the UK between January and the end of September. So what that's saying is, out of all those patients, the average time to detecting an arrhythmia was 3.6 days. And if you consider the fact that the vast majority of Holter systems are only on for 24 or 48 hours, you then begin to see why there are so many repeat tests. Next slide. So for us, the target areas, obviously, first and foremost, it is the cardiology department in the hospital trust. But of course, if you start to think about this service in terms of primary care, it clearly does make sense to start using systems like Zio to prevent many patients unnecessarily entering the secondary care system. We know, everybody knows that the majority of patients that go to their GP complaining about palpitations, 80 to 85% of those, there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. It's just normal palpitations, but they often enter the secondary care system. But we know also that it's quite challenging to introduce a product like this in primary care due to a lack of funding path, and ECG testing is rarely completed in that sector. But as we're talking here, obviously the big area that has shown a great deal of interest in Zio is the stroke sector. Has considerable interest. And of course, the focus on AF and stroke prevention by NHS and AHSN has really stimulated this. Next slide. Obviously, atrial fibrillation is a big concern for everybody at the moment. And when, unfortunately, the stroke physician is seeing the patient, it's obviously often after the event and often as a result of undiagnosed atrial fibrillation. And typically, they will have to put the patient through an ECG testing process, and that involves going typically, again, to the cardiology department, who are experiencing all the problems that we're describing in terms of long waiting lists, time to analysis, repeat testing because they're doing 24 or 48-hour Holter. And of course, all during that process, there is this risk of a further stroke occurring. And AF strokes, as we know, tend to be particularly debilitating. And as a result as well, there are unnecessary costs resulting, never mind the effect on the patient and the family of the patient concerned. Next slide. So hand in hand with this interest increasing, we've been talking to BARTs for some time, and there was a great deal of interest in Zio. And the other problem they had was that they didn't have a funding path for it. Basically, they have 3 sites where they investigate stroke: London, Newham, and Whips. And typically, they refer their patients to BARTs. It's the BARTs site for Holter fitting. They have very long waiting lists, sometimes up to 14 weeks, compounded by COVID, of course. repeat tests again for the reasons we've described, and further clinic visit if it's a positive AF, obviously to prescribe the anticoagulation. And that the BART's stroke team expressed their frustration at not really having any control over this service. Next slide, please. And then, as we were talking to them about 2 months ago, we were very lucky to be awarded an NHS X AI award. And that basically meant that a considerable amount of funding was made available to take these types of products and give them real world validation, if you like. The clinical validation is all done, but it's the real world validation that makes people think, right, this is something we ought to introduce. And of course, therefore, the BART stroke service was added to phase 1 of this program. And it is quite a complex program. We have to go through various checks on state of readiness, and that includes a pathway redesign. We obviously have to complete DPIA forms and business cases as well. Next slide. But hand in hand as well, we'd also been talking to UCLP for some time. I guess it's probably 18 months, I think now. And as this all started to glue together, it became very apparent that it was going to be extremely helpful for us to form a partnership with UCLP, as Susie's talked about this afternoon. Because they brought to the table a lot of aspects that we were struggling to achieve. And it's not just on introductions and comm support, but also actually fundamental project management, business case support, that real world validation I was talking about, and key to us, identifying those barriers that exist to long-term adoption. Because that's what the NHS X Award is about. It's introducing products that to give you the information, the data that says this really ought to be adopted on a long-term scale. Hand in hand with that will be a case study production and also developing the strategy for scaling, not just in BART, but potentially in the rest of the UCLP area. PR and education is also of great value, obviously, for the staff concerned. And we hope that this will go live early in January 2021. And that's my last slide, I think.
Great, thank you very much, Glyn. And I think we can have an interesting discussion later on around sort of modern advances towards ECG monitoring, because I think this is a really helpful advance in terms of the approach we should now be using. Our last talk today is from Paul Bogle, consultant interventional neuroradiologist at BART's NHS Trust. Previously, has European experience working at the Karolinska stroke team in Stockholm and in Stuttgart. To me, this is a topic dear to my heart. The major advance in stroke care, the initial one was in the 90s with thrombolysis, and I and others led helping the NHS adapt to be able to deliver thrombolysis. Took a long time to get there, and we're going through the same journey now with thrombectomy, which is a major advance, as you'll hear from Paul, in terms of improving outcomes from people with the more severe strokes due to large artery occlusion. So, Paul, over to you.
Lovely. Thanks for the introduction, Gary. Next slide, please. So I think in order to talk about mechanical thrombectomy, as Gary's alluded to, I want to initially talk a little bit about the structure that was in place with regards to thrombolysis, the clot-busting drug that Gary just mentioned, the data collection around that, then the mechanical thrombectomy pathway. And when I talk about thrombectomy, what I mean is physically removing the clot through a actual procedure, and the additional steps that that involves, then go on to how industry can potentially help and how we can work together as a collaborative in the future to continue to evolve and to deliver best care for patients. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the basics. The UK network for thrombolysis, the clot busting drug, has been very well established, and for well over a decade, and there's a sort of well-trodden pathway for that. This involves a number of what are called hyperacute stroke units dotted around the country, so that patients are never too far away from any of these sort of units, and they can be transferred to the hyperacute stroke unit and the emergency medicine departments for rapid assessment and delivery of the drug very quickly. Essentially, the pathway involves a patient being brought into the emergency department. Often the ambulance and the paramedics will phone ahead to the stroke team so that they know that they are going to be arriving within the next 5 to 10 minutes. The stroke team are then obviously waiting for the patient. There is then an assessment and a history taken as fast as possible to determine things like the severity of the stroke, the time of onset, which is important when delivering the drug, and any corroborative history that might be relevant from partners or friends or whoever may have attended. Then the patient requires imaging, and that typically involves a CT scan, what we call a plain CT scan, because you don't necessarily have to give dye in order to give the clot-busting drug. And then, dependent on what that scan shows, the drug can or cannot be given to the patient within certain other time limits and limits of the clinical history of the individual patient. So the main thing with regards to the imaging that's done is it's actually, like I said, a very straightforward imaging protocol. And the reason that it's straightforward is because what you really want to do is prove that there is no reason not to give the drug. So if you look at the left-hand image, that big white blob is actually a large bleed in the brain causing a stroke. And in that case, the last thing you want to do is give a clot-busting drug because then the bleed will potentially get much, much worse. So no IV TPA, no clot buster for that patient. Whereas on the right-hand side, you might be able to see a sort of thin sausage-like white blob in the middle of the brain that represents a blood clot. And in that case, you do want to give the drug because the clot buster may break up that clot and help save the patient's brain. Now, there are lots of time points and metrics that are recorded in what's called the SNAP National Audit Program. And this has been running to monitor how well the system is working and compare different units, as well as comparing different strategies if and when they are implemented. So essentially, the pathway is relatively clean. There's a few steps that are involved, typically under the control of the stroke doctors, with some involvement from CT radiographers and staff in CT scanners. Next slide, please. The mechanical thrombectomy pathway, move to the next slide. Yeah, there we go. The mechanical thrombectomy pathway, however, requires a lot more, basically, of everything. So the imaging is much more complicated. On the whole, you have to do advanced imaging, which involves what's called a CT angiogram. And the reason for that is you have to prove that a clot exists in order to go and remove it. Whereas with clot busting drugs, you don't technically have to prove that a clot is there. What you really want to do is say, this patient has clinical symptoms of a stroke. We know the time of onset, and there are no contraindications to giving the drug. With mechanical thrombectomy, you have to show where the clot is. That involves doing a CT angiogram and in some cases a perfusion CT scan, which is a more complicated form of imaging to help determine how much of the brain tissue is still salvageable and how much is has died, basically. You might need to do an MRI scan for strokes that occur in the back of the brain. That needs urgent access to MRI machines. These cause very large data sets to be created, and the interventional neuroradiologists, those of us that perform the procedure, need to review that imaging to determine whether the patient is suitable for the treatment and how to do the treatment, which often means you have to view the very large data sets online, because we're not often always at the hospital, for example, at the weekends or overnight. And so this is all sort of quite essential. Then you have to have access to what's called a biplane angiography suite, which is the sort of X-ray enabled operating room that we use. You have to have access to appropriately trained staff, not only the interventional neuroradiologists like myself, but the nurses trained to assist, the radiographers trained to use the X-ray equipment we require. Then you need the anesthetic staff, the ODPs and the assistants for the anaesthetists, as well as the correct equipment, not only for the procedure, but also for bailout procedures in case there's a complication. And you also then need neurosurgical support. You need access to an intensive care that's neuro-enabled in case the patient requires blood pressure support after the procedure, follow-up clinics, etc., etc. Next slide, please. But even then, I'm only painting half the picture. Because if you think about it, there are lots of relatively obvious questions that still arise. Who, for example, is going to transfer the patient? Should it be the stroke team, which may be the most efficient, or should it be the porters? But what happens if a second stroke comes in? Or what happens if there's a patient that requires thrombolysis? Who's going to deal with that? What about the location of the angiography suite? Is it on the same floor? What if you have to wait for lifts to go up and down floors, etc., etc.? So at the moment, it's quite difficult to envisage an ideal pathway. And each pathway is likely to vary slightly between the different hospital trusts, simply because of the different staffing levels, the different locations of equipment, etc., etc. But it's looking more and more likely that what will end up occurring, and the new trials are currently being conducted, is that in essence, the patients will become eligible for mechanical thrombectomy first, and in certain instances, and thrombolysis or clotbuster subsequently. So then the question becomes, how do we detect these patients early and accurately? Can we use, for example, helmet technology in the ambulance and potentially bypass the need for the early CT scan altogether? Can we also, for example, use the helmet technologies that are in development to say this is a patient is highly likely to have a large vessel occlusion that is amenable potentially to mechanical thrombectomy, and should we bring them straight to our angiogram suite and do the imaging that's required in our operating room? If that's the case, then we need to plan and purchase the correct equipment now so that it doesn't become defunct in several years, as some of the older angiography machines will do if we purchase that stuff now. This slide is basically just to show some of the routine equipment that is used in order to actually remove the clot and the sort of costs that are associated with it. As you can see, there are lots of different pieces of equipment. The nurses need to be constantly trained in order to make sure they know how to prepare the equipment, which different pieces of equipment goes with which. And as new equipment comes out consistently, sorry, next slide, as new equipment constantly comes out, this all requires training. And there are significant costs involved to this equipment. Personally, I use what's called a combined approach because it's been shown to be the most efficacious in getting clots out at the first attempt. The cost implications of that are that the procedure itself, if one just looks at equipment, can be in the region of about £7,000. Next slide, please. So in order to deliver mechanical thrombectomy efficiently, we have to look at all of these extra steps that exist on top of providing the clot-busting drug. It requires lots of coordination, effective lines of communication, the rapid transfer of patients between multiple different sites, a constant audit of the processes, and looking for constantly looking for ways to shave time off. And this essentially means that we have to have parallel processing, so different teams doing their own tasks in unison, in parallel, in order to minimize the time taken. So what occurs to me when we think about this problem is, next slide please, is this actually a supply chain problem? And how then can industry help with this problem? So from my experience working with companies, especially multinational and larger companies, is that they are experts at supply chain problems and optimizing multi-step processes. Next slide, please. If you think about it, they have to often get equipment across national borders to strict deadlines in order to manufacture equipment and then ship that equipment out in order to meet specific deadlines. And this requires a whole host of different expertises. So they will have people who are comfortable with audit, data capture and analysis, workflow assessments, workflow design, supply chain management. These are all skills that are essential in designing optimized pathways for not only patients with strokes, but any time-critical problems. And in actuality, just getting patients in and out of healthcare scenarios in general. I think one of the most important things that working with industry offers is that they have manpower, time and resources, which are frankly some of the most limited things for clinicians like myself and Gary. As we're trying to work to deal with acute patients, it can become very difficult to find time to do all of these things and think outside of the box to look for novel solutions. So one of the things that my team and I have recently done is we've worked hand in hand with Johnson & Johnson, who've come in and looked at our pathways and actually identified pinch points that we had not thought of. And we're currently trying to work out ways in order to optimize those sort of bottlenecks. Next slide, please. So I think if we work together, to coin a current day phrase, we're stronger together. I think this would in all likelihood result in more mechanical thrombectomies being performed and quicker, which would hopefully translate to better patient outcomes. And whilst that might result in higher hospital costs, it would actually translate to overall lower societal costs. So I think this is quite important that we work together. I think there are different ways in which we can create win-win cost structures or general win-win scenarios. And that's one of the things that I'd like to talk a little bit about now, which is, for example, can we link equipment costs to results? So, for example, if a trial shows that stent retriever X pulls out the clot at the first attempt 50% of the time, if when using that device you are not seeing those results, perhaps the company could negotiate with the trust or with the NHS in general, providing some failed equipment at cost zero, or providing equivalent devices for free, for example. How about we work together to create bundle prices for equipment? So if a company produces a stent retriever X and the clinician uses the microcatheter that the company also produces, rather than each being charged at £1,000, for example, what if there's a 25% reduction in the cost? Perhaps we could also look at limiting the upper end of costs of equipment per procedure, in case you have to use several different devices. This would all, I think, help create trust and closer collaboration. But I think the working together needs to go beyond cost, and I think that's where the future of collaboration, I think, truly lies, because I think we should be working together to try and develop joint research projects. For example, creating data banks, looking at clot analysis with regards to stroke. How do we optimize mechanical thrombectomy strategies, different pieces of equipment, for example, and that can be cross-company. What about optimizing the equipment based on imaging analysis or proteomics, so blood markers that might suggest if you use this particular equipment for this type of clot, you're much more likely to pull it out on the first attempt, compared to maybe you need a different technique for a different type of clot. And we already know that that kind of thing does exist. I think Ireland is a very good example where they've had very close collaboration between industry, government and universities. And there's been a lot of government support and government assistance to help, frankly, a flourishing neurointerventional scene develop, particularly in Galway. And I don't really see why the UK can't replicate some of that success. I think sponsorship programs for training that can go beyond training the doctors, training the nurses to prepare the equipment, run through scenarios of a stroke occurring can also be developed, and training sites can be found in assistance with the companies. And I think one of the other things is often companies have or their companies work together with clinicians from other countries, and they may have access to more experience. And so putting UK clinicians in touch with clinicians, for example, in France or Germany or further afield, who maybe have gone through various different iterations of mechanical thrombectomy pathways or different strategies, and sharing that knowledge is also something that is very useful. And I think that is pretty much everything I'd like to say. So that's it.
Thank you, Paul. We've now got half an hour left. Speakers all run to time, which is great for questions. And there's a comment, but not a question. I'll wait for things to come into the box, but maybe I can just start with a general comment, sort of question, and whoever wants to pick it up. So the Xia patch, even before the pandemic, I was sort of saying I couldn't see what the role for 24-hour Holter ECG monitors was. It was very clunky technology. You need to monitor people for longer or not bother at all. And there's quite a lot of options now for how to do that. So, you know, what you'd expect to see happening in a sort of industry that was keeping efficient was you would disinvest, you'd remove all of your 24-hour ECG monitoring equipment and move over to not necessarily a single technology, but some of the technologies like the Xia patch, which we've seen. But it's just notoriously difficult to do. So I'd just like to ask the panel's views on why does the NHS find it so difficult to disinvest in old approaches whilst it's transferring over slowly, as we know, to new approaches? And I'm going to ask you, Suzanne, first of all.
I think from some of the work, obviously we've been doing within UCLP, an awful lot of sort of hesitancy is around this sort of change management associated with the complete sort of out the door and another one in. And I suppose where we've recognised a real value add in that regard is actually involving sort of quality improvement teams, etc., in some of that work, and ensuring that various stakeholders within a provider, for example, is engaged in what the benefits could be. Sometimes it will be the clinical team that owns the understanding of what benefits are going to be recognised by the system, whereas I think that internal communications within individual providers is key. But it can be a challenging thing to approach with a new innovation. But I think through the networking created by the HSNs and others, it's slowly improving.
I can add from the industry side, if you like, in terms of what we've experienced. And there's, to be fair, I think that you have to remember that the Holter device is probably 50 years old, maybe older than that now, and so it's really been the only device that's been around for all that time, and people are just plain used to doing 24 or 48-hour testing. And it's very difficult, you know, some of these cardiologists, really difficult to make them think differently. And to be fair, hand in hand with that, they are working within a system that is designed to suit that type of process. So, for example, the tariff system, which thankfully is slowly going, but the tariff system defined how much you were able to pay for an ECG test, and disregarded the overall cost of the clinic fees, the repeat tests, and all the things I was talking about, actually. So when you add all that up, that system is actually costing quite a bit more than some of the newer technologies that are out there. But it's very, very difficult to change. And that's why we are going through all these processes that I was alluding to get there. As you say, Gary, it's a very slow process, unfortunately. And I think that's the nature of the beast, I suppose, is the...
It's frustrating as a stroke clinician to see, because people who have a minor stroke or TIA, probably most of the audience listening are aware, if they're in sinus rhythm, if you look long enough, you'll find a paroxysmal intermittent AF in around 10 to 15%. But you have to optimally monitor for about 2 to 3 weeks. You can debate about how long, but it's certainly not 24 hours or 3 days or 5 days. But currently, I know many services in the country still only have access to 24-hour ECG recordings. In our case, we get 5-day monitoring, but patients have to wait 2 to 3 months for it, which is kind of, again, waiting too long, because it does change immediately how you manage someone. You switch them from antiplatelet therapy to anticoagulants to the stroke. I think the other reflection I would have is when we surveyed the needs of the NHS for research and innovation, the top priority that came out was workforce, meaning productivity. And then if you look at what some of the technology offer for that, you take all this workload off a group who we have a lot of workforce shortages, ECG and cardio technicians. Yeah. And you know, so to me, it's a fairly attractive offer, but it still is quite difficult, perhaps, as you say, because of both culture and habit, but also the commissioning system is not exactly facilitatory always.
I think if I could just jump in and make a comment, which is also sort of from personal experience as well. I mean, several years ago, I invented a new technique, much safer, in fact, for treating what's called cerebral vasospasm, which can occur after a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Was going to be much safer. It is much safer. I've done it many times now and not had any complications. And that involved then designing new devices and getting patents and stuff like this. And during that process, I learned about this whole sort of way of categorizing people, essentially, or the way people think. And essentially, it divides people up into pioneers, early adopters, and then you've got everybody else. And my personal feeling is that in the UK, it's almost a little risky to be considered a pioneer. And an early adopter is kind of okay, but to be the pioneer group is perhaps not overly encouraged, in my opinion. I think also we're very heavily reliant on randomized controlled trial data rather than observational data, anecdotal evidence. I think there was a lot of observational data, for example, coming out from many different centers around mechanical thrombectomy for many, many, many years. And this was still kind of a little bit not dealt with the degree of respect that it probably should have had. And so I think this is also part of the problem. So we also, I think, need to develop a system where people start to look at, let's say, observational data, early data, and say, what if this is correct? What are we going to do? What if this is right? How are we going to manage the implementation of this new device or this new strategy or this new type of technique? How are we going to deal with this? And I don't think that's a big ask personally, but it does require time and resource. And those are the two things that people in the NHS have the least of.
No, and I think they're interesting points you raised. I'm going to pick up on a couple of them and see what other people think. I think on the point of, you know, the what if and preparing the NHS for if something's coming, it was obvious to all of us in the field, whatever we thought about whether we needed the randomized controlled trials, that thrombectomy was going to have a place in stroke management. The question was in how many patients, in what sort of groups, and the trials did, of course, define that. But there was no preparation. I do think the research infrastructure did understand that. So NIHR, for example, funded a program grant where we looked at how would you best organise stroke services to deliver thrombectomy across the country, and they funded us before the randomised controlled trials came. So we were able to make the case to the research infrastructure. But I think you're right. There's very little kind of planning ahead as to how services will change, and we're always designing our services for the problems now and what we had in the last 5 years, and not the services we need in 10 years' time. And of course, it takes about that long to establish a national implementation framework. I actually have a slightly different perspective on innovators and early adopters, because I think the UK is very good for an environment for innovators, particularly the research ecosystem. The thing we value, and we kind of try and hunt out people, and they're hard to find as an NHS network, is the early adopters, because they're key to getting your changing an invention into an innovation that is actually being deployed and has a market. And so we try to give credit, because early adopters often don't get much credit either. They tend to be hidden by the glory of the inventors. We try and sort of build capacity and support early adopters, and early adopters tend not to be necessarily in research fields. They can be, but I'll be interested in comments from others about this issue. I mean, the people we try and avoid completely are what they on the Rogers adoption curve are the laggards, because we think CQC need to deal with them, and it's why we hate to have to implement 100%, because you meet this hard we will only do something and they're basically arrested if they don't do it. So, but Luella and Suzanne, any comments on this issue of early adopters?
Yeah, I think Paul hit the nail on the head when he said that, the people who go first tend to be the ones who are looked at with some sort of confusion as to why have you done that? And actually, we do need to build an environment where people can do what happens in industry, which is fail and fail fast, but fail safely. And that does require the use of wider data sets. And it's good to see that in NICE's work around the methods and process review, they are looking at extending the data that they use in a robust way, but stretching out from just looking at randomized controlled trial data, because particularly in your space, sometimes doing the randomized controlled trial would actually be unethical, because you know that there's a solution you could give the patient that would save their life there and then. So I think a lot of that has to happen. The funding and the way the funding drives behavior also comes into it, because even if you've got an innovative, forward-looking clinician, if the financial framework that they are forced to live within doesn't allow them to look longer term, look at the benefits for the patient outside the in-year saving that the NHS might need to make that year, you're never going to be able to make some of those changes. And I've long been an advocate for pathway transformation to be funded, but also for there to be a longer vision for where you get the return on the investment. And that does mean for technologies very specifically, it tends to be later in the patient's life that you see the benefit. So those are some of my reflections on the innovation space.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was just going to add, I think, around the sort of, I suppose it's ultimately celebration of success, really, isn't it? And of NHS partners that have chosen to be early adopters. And I think there were some learnings that came out of the NHS Innovation Accelerator specifically to actually begin to do that more frequently across the country, because it creates a network, a community of practice, really, a community of change across the NHS. And I think that's something we're wanting to definitely do more. Equally, I think those sort of pioneers, actually, that there is this sort of a grouping of digital pioneers based within our region and actually across the country, And we have sort of a real engagement plan to support those digital pioneers and really begin to network them to understand that they're not alone in their pioneering to some extent, and actually to build an engagement network for future innovations, future technologies. And what's lovely about those pioneers is they're not just clinical teams, they're also teams from frontline, from service managers, administrative staff that really are ready to advocate for the change. And I think that's equally important. I think one way we're also supporting some of this evidence generation that's been discussed as well, away from the RCTs as you've described, and it's more about that pragmatic building of evidence. Real world validation is a key part of what the AHSN is supposed to do, but where we have wanted to support a couple of our providers that are trying to do things a bit differently and saying, if this pilot, dare I say that word on this the webinar, should this work, then we are willing to commission and procure the product long term. So there is almost a sort of a guarantee or an acceptance that if you are evidencing it in the real world and it's practically doing everything you say it's going to do, how can we sort of almost share that risk with the industry partner? And I think that's quite an interesting thing that we'd like to sort of begin to talk about more in our work with industry.
Yeah, thanks. I think really interesting points, and I'd agree with all of those. We have got some questions coming in. One is a comment from Ruben Olivier. The current NHS tariff for thrombectomy is 17,000. I think that's right. It was lower than that. I think it's been increased, if I remember correctly, Paul. I think what's interesting is I remember in the early days, I actually went on national media saying we needed a tariff, which we did. But even when the tariff is in place, and it does cover the costs, the modelling work we've done is 17,000 does cover the costs. You still have all the many barriers. So people often focus on finance, but we find in fact it's more complex than that in terms of implementation. And my own view would be, even if the tariff was higher, I'm not sure it would actually drive what we need organisations to do and systems to do. And you may want to comment on that point, Paul. There's another question from Ruben saying, this is a digital question, I think, which is around, maybe Suzanne, you might want to answer, which is who owns the data and what percent? So the dreaded issue of who owns data when you're doing digital innovation. But either of you can pick those questions up.
I'll just jump in just through our sort of, I suppose we're this sort of broker, I would say, between the partnership, and it does tend to be quite bespoke and case by case. There are now teams forming actively within our providers that are really trying to set up a more robust process around data sharing agreements with the NHS. And I know the NHSX itself as an organisation is actively trying to make it easier for data access between industry and commercial organisations and the NHS. Where we advocate is that where the data is going to be used to form something new, as I've described in my slides around co-design and creating new IP, etc., and that the NHS is able to gain from that. I think that's probably widely accepted, but there should always be a mechanism for that to be reimbursed. But it's a tricky subject, and I hate answering questions about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's evolving. I mean, my own trust and Oxford University have partnered up with the data company Sensign. So there are early forays into this, but it does need clarity over avoiding any conflicts of interest, as you say, who actually is controlling the data, and importantly, what are the data being used for, which patients sometimes have individual strong views about. Any comments, Paul, on the? I mean, if you had to, would you do anything with the finance structure to try and help systems implement thrombectomy better? I mean, is it money, or is actually this nothing to do with money?
So I think as with all things, there's lots of different strings that need to come together in order to implement a system effectively. Kind of like along the lines of the stuff that I sort of presented. Now, I would agree with you that I think money is part of the issue. I think one of the other things is actually this. So this is going to sound ridiculous, but it's such a simple thing. Was when I first started at the Royal London Hospital back in May 2018, you perform the mechanical thrombectomy using a stent retriever, as I'm sure you're very well aware of, Gary. A stent retriever is a stent that you grab the clot with and you pull through the blood vessel to remove the clot. Now, what my colleagues had been doing prior to that was aspirating. So they just go in with a tube and suck out the clot. And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't, like with all different techniques. So I'd been reporting, using a stent retriever to pull out the blood clot. That got interpreted by the coders as me permanently implanting a stent into the vasculature of the brain, which carried a completely different tariff. Something in the region of about, I think, £2,000, or let's say something. And so huge sums of money were not coded for correctly. And so this raises a sort of another point, which is when we think about new procedures and, pioneers and early adopters and implementing things effectively, we need to think about the wider teams that are involved and educating those people. And it reminds me of when, for example, when I used to talk to Professor Anderson over at the Karolinska, and he would say, we had meetings with everybody involved with mechanical thrombectomy. That meant everybody. So, for example, the paramedics, the porters, they would say, look, your role is incredibly important because if you don't transfer the patient quickly, me doing the procedure fast doesn't make a difference. And I think sometimes that holistic approach just does not get done. And again, it comes down to this, we're all swamped with work. We are limited in terms of time and capacity. And so how are we going to adequately educate everybody that's involved in these pathways? And that's hard. It takes time and it's going to be hard, but we have to work out a way to do it fast and effectively. And maybe that does involve collaborating with industry or making videos, for example, like people have suggested, in order to optimize all of these things.
Yeah, and I think that's another important point that you're indirectly getting at with your story is, if you want to run a particular time-critical pathway efficiently, you have to have clear delegation of tasks to individuals to deliver it. And what I see all the time in the NHS is it's never clear. You would spend years trying to get people to do very specific things with thrombolysis. And as you say, I used to go around saying, look, there's about 8 things you have to do to deliver thrombolysis. And it's things like, who draws up the drug? Who is going to examine the patient? Who's going to request a CT scan? But what happens is it changes the time depending on the time of day, and there's no clarity of roles. And so if you come and look at this as a sort of a production process, anybody from industry outside will look at this and say this is incredibly inefficient because you just and I think that is one of the major issues we come up to, and you then get things like, which I don't mind, like the consultant is pushing the trolley of the patient into the CT room. Now, that may be the most efficient way to do it, but it's unlikely to be. So I think there's a lot of work around the sort of the pathway which you can really get that gain from.
Yeah.
There's another question from Amy, which is, and I have to make sure I understand the question properly. Is it as simple as changing the model? So I'm not quite clear what model we're talking about. There's a number of models. So one thing we always come up against is the financial model, which I think has been mentioned before. Any change process in the NHS, if you're doing a business case, you generally won't get a positive return on your investment, even if ultimately that change will give you that till 2 or 3 years. And yet the financial framework for NHS planning, with a few exceptions, and as capital, is 1 year, which we think acts as a major limitation. We've had some progress on that, with the AAC rapid uptake products, where they're now willing to consider a modelling timeframe of 3 years for benefits to the NHS, but that is not the framework we're operating in when we're sort of helping our partners sort of make the case for change and building a business case. But any other general comments on the kind of that question, the model, which I think is not just finance, but is more general issues around the model of commissioning and provider split, for example?
I would just jump in and say I think particularly what's happened over COVID is obviously accelerating sort of virtualizing sort of pathways, but also secondary care clinics, or all of these things, which in my mind would be the interpretation of a new model of care. Alongside that is the movement to ICSs and integrated care systems, which actually provides an awful lot more opportunity for true value to be recognised in the system without somebody saying, well, it doesn't affect me, or the benefit won't be seen at my point in the pathway. So I feel like the opportunity really is now to begin looking at new ways and models of doing things, and I think we're a real advocate. I talk broadly as UCLP, but also as the HSN network, for enabling that change. And what's been lovely over the COVID period is actually clinicians that were, dare I say, somewhat freed up because certain services weren't happening, were actually given capacity to think about how to do things differently and what a new pathway could and should look like. So I would love to see that continue, and we're very keen to keep that engagement going, so it's enabled going forward as well.
Yeah,
I think. I think that question of the model of care. There was a bit more to that question, which was, I think it was talking about, do we require a mindset change as well? And I think I would honestly answer yes. I think we do require a mindset change. I'm sure we've all seen it. And in fact, we're talking about the mindset change that occurred when COVID hit. And I mean, it hit us all pretty hard, and it's still kicking us whilst we're down. But the great thing was that people in the NHS and the wider community were so responsive and actually could adapt really quickly. And there was some really great work done. And how do we keep that going? Well, I think that's actually a really complicated question that was probably going to need a much longer debate. But it's definitely something that we should be talking about and thinking about. And how do we keep pushing forward and adapting what is in essence a great system for patients?
Yes, I mean, I think one perspective I take, thinking certainly about stroke, which was untreatable, was considered untreatable when I started as a consultant back in '92. We just had some data on the benefits of stroke units, but I think when that first trial of thrombolysis came out, I remember reading it in 1995 in the New England Journal of Medicine, the NINS trial, and I was running a service where I still had people arguing that not every stroke patient needed a CT scan. And we're not talking about a CT scan within 1 hour, we're talking about a CT scan ever. Yeah. And you have to sort of think about where you're trying to get to. And again, we were the first site in England to start delivering a thrombolysis protocol before the license, and it was difficult. We were often challenged, but we were treating very small numbers of people, very tightly criteria. I mean, literally like 1 a month, 2 a month. And I remember a senior academic in stroke from elsewhere saying, gosh, I thought you'd be treating many more. And I said, well, this is a long game. I know we will be treating more patients. And of course, now we treat in our centre 20% of patients, which well-organised centres can do. And I think you have to be able to see where you're going to get to with the potential of a treatment. And often that is lacking when services are being designed and thinking about that. And I think for many disease areas, it seems to me, particularly if you're a specialist and an expert in the area, you can kind of see where the service is going to end up in 5 or 10 years. But it's very difficult to make the first move because people kind of can't see the immediate benefit of that small change one is making to get to the longer term real quality service. So I think we are agreed the model needs to change, and we do think people need to be able to innovate more. And I have to say, and I'm not talking about the researchers now, in one sense I agree with what you were saying, Paul, because when I was a consultant in the 90s, I could make many changes to a service in a way I can't now. And it would be said, well, you were doing that without good governance and without a business plan. But actually, we did some really good things, and not just in stroke, in terms of reorganising older people's services. And I think it's harder now, I have to say, as a clinician, to drive an idea.
Yeah.
We've got 1 minute left, and there's no more questions. There must be a horde of silent people listening to us, because we've only had 2 people ask us questions. So I hope this is a conversation, not just amongst 7 people. But any final comments, particularly around industry collaboration, since that was a topic of this? Luella.
So I was just going to say that the system needs to all be doing the same thing at the same time, and that's part of the problem. I think individual clinicians will be thinking about the intervention of that patient. Some will be thinking before and after their intervention, some may not, but the financial system needs to think of the patient before and after the immediate intervention as well. And when we can get to that point, we can start to move things forward. And actually, on the industry collaboration, I know there are many companies who do have lean trained people within their teams who are quite happy to go into hospitals, bring people together and do that process mapping, and then do some of the heavy lifting, so that you clinicians can do what you need to do, but they can come back and say, we spent 2 hours together, this is what you told us the pathway looks like, and this is what you want it to look like. So actually then bring some of the solutions for you to then implement, which takes some of that pain away.
I completely agree with that. Our medical director got a quote which he says, which is, don't do digital, don't do cancer, don't do diagnostics, do clinical pathways. And I would say AHSN, we always try and focus on the pathway and to optimize the value of innovation, and also make sure it's meeting the needs in that pathway. I think that's really critical. Glyn, Paul, Suzanne, any final comments?
I just suppose, again, from the industry side, and it's been very interesting listening to the conversation, and what Paul said about how change can be slow, and I think, Gary, you said it can be very slow until it really takes off. And I suppose just from our side of the fence, and having worked in the industry for so many years, and I can look back before there was ever an AHSN, before there was NHSX, and so on and so forth, and think how damn hard it was just to introduce a routine product, never mind something that was a bit revolutionary or different. So it might be small steps, and there's still a long way to go, but for us, it's a massive step in the right direction.
Yeah, thanks. And let's hope the innovation ecosystem is stable. The history is, it's always reinvented every 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
We've gone 8 years as their percent, so we're doing quite well, I think, at the moment.
I think probably my final point on this topic is, I think the one thing that I really think the NHS has in its favour, and it really can be world beating, is the system itself, because it is a truly national system. If we can position in place appropriate data capture, etc., we'll be able to catch up to virtually any other country or any other healthcare system much faster than most other places. And I say this as someone that's worked in several other countries prior. And the classic example would be, for example, with regards to mechanical thrombectomy, my team and I have created a standardized templated report which captures everything, so that anyone can come back and look at our results, critique them, audit them, say you've done this wrong or that wrong. If we were to create the same thing for every MT occurring in the NHS, within a couple of years, you would have data sets in the thousands that would mean comparator between different devices, different techniques, and huge amounts of data. And yet we don't push this kind of system forward, which holds us back.
Yeah, I think real-world data registry is absolutely key, and an opportunity the NHS has yet to properly realise. Completely agree. Okay, well, thanks very much to our poor speakers and panelists. I hope the audience, we cannot see you, but we hope you've enjoyed it, and thanks for the questions. Okay, bye everyone.
Bye-bye.